So the key limitations to crowdsourcing for data acquisition. In general, crowdsourced data can be very good for certain types of questions. For example, if you'd like to know what the crowd thinks, it's a great way to find out. Why don't you ask them? A more deeper consideration, though, you have to consider, what did the people who didn't answer think, right? Were the people who did answer trying to please you? Were they trying to make you think they were smart? What was the unintended impact of not answering? Was there some groupthink going on? Was there an incentive applied to the people who answered the question? Did they make, a 5 cents for every question they answered? They're going to tend to answer more questions. So I think we need to think through more deeply, what did the crowd look like? What did the silent part of the crowd think? And of course we don't know because they didn't answer, but how do we treat that statistically? And then really, are we asking a question that is legitimately answered by a crowd? Might you ask the crowd who the most popular candidate is in the upcoming? Sure, those are the kinds of things we do in an election. But are you going to ask the crowd, is it safe to do X or Y or Z? Why would the crowd know that? So I think you have to be very careful about the types of questions you ask a crowd. You have to be very careful about how you know what's true, and you have to be very careful about the silent part of the crowd that didn't answer in general. So advice for people entering the field of data science. First and foremost, I would say probably no better time to think about that type of a career than now. This is the era of that. Having said that, there's a lot of people sort of rebranding themselves as data scientists, and they're either mathematicians or they're database people. So you have to really understand what it means, and it means a number of things. In general, my advice would be 3 things. First of all, be humble. Whatever you know, whatever you're good at when you enter that field, and whatever you think you learned in school or however you became qualified, that's what got you in the door. But those people that are already in the door, they kind of know something already. So be careful that you're teaching and learning. Be careful that you're humble, that you don't think that you're coming in with all the answers. You're coming in with a set of skills, but there's also people there that have skills that need to be respected and need to be integrated into this discipline that you're bringing to the table. The second thing I would say is, don't ever lead with the data or with the technology. Lead with a question. So it's very easy in data science to get trapped by, we're going to use this type of technology, or we're going to use this data set to answer a question. That's bad science. If you're going to be a scientist, you've got the problem upside down. You've got to ask a question first. You've got to make an observation and ask a question and do a whole bunch of other things before you start collecting data. So always lead with a good, well-formed question that's well understood, so you'll know when you're done. And then the third thing I would say is, I often phrase this as making new mistakes. Make sure that you capture learnings. Make sure that whatever work you do, you've documented what was the question you were trying to answer, what was the methodology used, what did you learn, and what are the sort of questions for future research, so that you can go back later and understand what hypotheses were rejected, what technologies didn't work maybe and why, what sort of dead ends you went down, all of those things. So we've got to capture learnings and make sure that we're incorporating them into our future research. So the state of data acquisition now compared to, say, 5 or 10 years ago, I would say it is much harder now than it was 5 or 10 years ago. It's ironic because you might think in a big data world we've got so much more data now that it must be easier. But in fact, it's a lot harder from a regulatory standpoint because of all the laws around where you must keep the data, how the data may or may not transmit across borders, what's considered personal and private. These are all things that are being treated in laws all over the world, and truth be told, some of these laws conflict with each other. They have differing views on the same thing. It becomes very, very difficult to operate globally. At the same time, those lawmakers that are writing those laws have a very ominous responsibility because they can have an unintended impact on their country or on their region by governing certain things in a certain way that's overly restrictive. They can slow down business, they can marginalize their constituencies, etc. These are very, very big questions that I think lawmakers all over the world, I should say I know, are dealing with. And some of them are doing an extraordinarily good job of understanding what others have done and really understanding these impacts. But it's a new era, and we're going to have to learn a lot more about that. So the latest trends to hit data science, there are many. So just to name a few, the Internet of Things is really important. We're thinking about what kind of data our things might create as opposed to we ourselves or our systems or our processes. Cloud computing continues to be an important consideration in terms of where do we keep the data, public clouds, private clouds, hybrids. So the technology is well understood now, but the usage of it is still evolving. Certainly mobile applications in general are becoming more and more mature as the things start to talk to the people and the people interact with the things. That's certainly very important. And I think just this, in general, this idea of connected space, that data sets that otherwise wouldn't be connected or all of a sudden connected. You can do an online check-in to your hotel. You're not in the hotel. So what does it mean that you checked in online? It means that you've sort of promised to get there. And in turn, they've promised to do certain things for you before you get there. But you've sent them a signal, and they can use that signal to maybe get a little closer to renting all the rooms, things like that. So if you multiply that by thousands and thousands, you see what's going on in the big data world. So the challenges to collecting private company information in the United States and really all over the world are, some of them are the challenges that have been there all along, that small companies that are not public don't have to report any information to anybody. There's no requirement. I should say, by the way, that these terms private and public have different meanings around the world. So if we just think about a company that's sort of small and it's not traded on a stock exchange and it's owned by one or a small group of people, that's kind of what we're talking about. In general, the first challenge is that they're only going to share information that they seem to think there's value in sharing. And the data that's collectible about them elsewhere is going to be limited if it's a small business, if it's operating in a small geography. So the footprint, the digital footprint that they have is limited. And then the persistence of that information. Small companies tend to operate in very small silos. They tend to operate with a very small group of counterparties. So the number of ways that you can discover information about them is relatively small. Now the good news about that is many of those challenges are being somewhat mitigated by big data. So since we have so many more signals, since we have so many more sources of data connected to other sources of data, even if we can't see the data about that business itself, we can see signals. We can see, in effect, the hole it makes through its digital environment as it moves through it. And we can infer a lot of things about businesses through signals and proxies that was never possible before. So, very exciting time to be looking at smaller businesses. So what sets Dun & Bradstreet apart from other information providers? First of all, I think of Dun & Bradstreet as doing more than just providing information. We talk about finding truth and meaning in the data, and I think to many accounts we are in fact doing that quite a bit more now than we were ever before in the past. We used to look at the size of the database, we would look at the number of records, we would look at how frequently we updated it. Of course, we still look at all of that, but we look at much more now. We look at how entities are reacting and interacting with each other. We look at different types of business behavior. We look at different types of analytical measures of how the universe is changing and how the individuals are changing. So the big thing that I think sets apart the Dun & Bradstreet data from other sources of data about businesses is, first of all, its global reach. Second of all, the degree of curation that goes on, how carefully we consider making sure that it's accurate, complete, timely, consistent across borders. And finally, it's just the fact that the number of places that we can interact with, because of the size and tenor of the organization and its worldwide network, we're able to collect information across borders in different parts of the world. We're able to understand the compliance and the regulatory constraint in different parts of the world. We're able to be very good stewards of that information as we collect it and as we use it to make these decisions. There are so many common misconceptions about the Dun & Bradstreet information that it's hard to pick one, but I think probably the single most common misconception is that it's one database, and that somehow you can look at that one database and see everything there is to see. No one can look at all of the databases that we have at any one time and see all that there is to see, because this is an incredibly dynamic, incredibly diverse set of information. It's collected from hundreds of countries in different languages, in different writing systems, from different data supply chains. We have a common ontology, a common way of connecting and collecting the information and bringing it into one place. But even that process is a sort of a publication. There's judging of the truth, there's validations and audits that occur. So this is a highly dynamic set of information. It is not a static database that I can push a button and give you all the data that there is. There's a dynamic nature to it that I think often gets overlooked. So what advice would I have for a user of a public library who's sitting down to look at Dun & Bradstreet information, say for a small business for the first time? I think the first thing I would say to them is don't jump to conclusions about what you expect to find there. Spend a little time understanding what types of data are readily available for very small companies, for very new companies, for larger companies. What is the typical experience? We talk about the character and quality of data a lot. Understand the character and quality of the data vis-a-vis the question you want to ask, and understand really what you expect to find there versus what you're seeing, and what that difference is and why it might be true. If you think about it, an example, if you're trying to find information about a business that just started, how much would you really expect to find out about that business? Hopefully you'd be able to find out that they exist, their name, their phone number, their address, things like that. Would you realistically expect to find a detailed history of how they've interacted in the credit community for the last 10 years? No, they haven't been around, right? Would you really expect to be able to find maybe information about a rich set of individuals or contacts for an organization like that? Maybe there aren't a lot of people associated with such a small business. So I think just be very, very thoughtful about what you expect to find when you go and look, and then spend a little time understanding what you tend to find before you jump to any conclusions. And it's true for any data set, I think. So is there an industry that's creating data in a way that makes me say, wow? There are so many industries right now that are creating data that makes me say, wow, that it's hard to pick one. But I think the one that I feel like saying wow to today is probably the Internet of Things, right? We have a whole set of things out there that are creating data. Most of us wear these things, carry these things with us, interact with these things in our daily life. And it's a little bit of the Wild West right now. There's not a complete way for these things to discover each other, to protect themselves against each other, to share data with each other, to understand what each other does and how that works. So these digital conversations that are occurring right now are primitive, and they're very focused, and they're sometimes used in surprisingly unintended ways to do things that, some of which are malfeasant, some of which are just bad practice. So I think we have the opportunity to kind of accelerate the speed with which we hit the wall, or to do some really exciting things here with the Internet of Things. And it's up to us to be maybe a little bit more thoughtful than we've been in terms of just solving a particular use case versus the broader perspective of the way this data might be used. So what measures are taken by Dun & Bradstreet to ensure data quality? As you probably know, we have a vast array of people all over the world looking at the quality and character of the data and trying to assure a common experience when you use this data. And at the same time, it's unrealistic to expect the quality of data all over the world to be the same. Even what quality means needs to be parsed out a little bit. So we look at the accuracy, the completeness, the timeliness, the cross-border consistency of the data. These are some of the things that we measure when we look at the overall experience. And of course, we look for all of those things to be monotonically increasing over time, so improving over time, not sliding backwards. But at the same time, things might change in the world around us. Things might happen that cause certain types of data that used to be available to be unavailable. Laws are passed, things become unpermissible that were permissible. Business practices change. You have events that occur like natural disasters or changes in business behavior, and all of these things have an impact on the data. So we have to constantly be looking at the macro picture, the regulatory picture, the internal measures, what are we doing to the data to treat it internally, and finding a healthy balance among all of these interventions and curation processes to create that common experience as much as possible. So what is the greatest data challenge facing Dun & Bradstreet in the next 5 years? Probably the greatest data challenge is the commoditization of data. Data is everywhere. We have lost the ability as a human race not only to measure how much data there is, but even to measure the rate at which it's increasing. And so if your value proposition is just that you have a lot of data, that's an increasingly narrow and thin piece of ice that you're standing on, right? We need to have value that goes way beyond just being the bringers of the data. We have to make sense out of the data. We talk about finding truth and meaning in data. Do we understand what this data means? Can we realistically hear, small changes in data against a sea of changes of data? Can we understand what parts of it are changing and moving and how it's connecting with each other? Can we find the relevance of that significant small portion of data in that trivial huge portion of data that's obscuring it? So the biggest challenge, I think, is that you can't be in the data business. You have to be in the business of making sense out of that information and connecting it to a real business question. So what is the greatest data challenge faced by end users in the library market? While I'm not an expert in the library market, I've certainly used a lot of libraries in my life. And to me, it seems that one of the biggest challenges is the overall sense that information is out there and free for the taking. I can go on my phone and I can go on a search engine and I can find the answer to anything. And it must be true because it's on the internet. And the job of a library is to find the best sources of information, to curate them, to bring them together, to make them relevant, to make them accessible to the constituency that's trying to use the library, and to do that in a way that remains relevant as information gets commoditized and access becomes more ubiquitous. So libraries, what a library is changing over time, and how we use it is changing over time, and the types of problems that we come to the library with are themselves changing. And I think the challenge in library science and in any real science that deals with information today is to change with those changes in behavior, to anticipate them, and to remain relevant as the perception of the value of information is changing and the quantity of information is changing. So what is the most underutilized data set of information available for Dun & Bradstreet? In order to answer a question like that, I think you have to narrow your focus into either total risk or total opportunity, which are the two families of questions that we tend to answer for our customers. In the total risk side, I think there's a lot of focus on scores, there's a lot of focus on the numbers, and maybe not so much focus on the changes in behavior, maybe not so much focus on understanding the broader changes across a demographic, what's happening to the industry, what's happening to the users of the information in that industry. So if you look at what we can see in terms of signals and proxies, signals are small pieces of information that don't necessarily have a lot of value in and of themselves, but when you take them collectively, they start to have a lot of value. We have this data, and we use it with certain customers to answer some incredibly powerful questions. Most people don't even realize we have that data and certainly don't envision those questions. That would be an example. A proxy would be data that we would like to have but we don't have, so we try to construct other information that can help us answer the same kinds of questions. Again, we do this sort of thing all the time, but I think many of our customers don't realize that we do it, and therefore we don't get engaged in those conversations. In terms of the total opportunity side, there's a lot of focus on contacts. There's a lot of focus on give me a name, give me an address, give me a phone number, give me a web email address, give me anything I can to contact that individual. But if we step back, the questions that normally sit behind marketing, having the right message to the right person at the right time in the right context, we have lots of other data that could help inform all of those rights. And I think we tend to get cornered into giving out the data that's at the end of that journey without really getting involved in the rest of the journey. And I think we could do a good job helping with the rest of that journey. So how often do we update our profiles for US companies? We don't have a specific number that we do it at a certain interval. There are a lot of things that go into get factored into how often a particular profile would get updated. But in general, we have an approach that's highly automated that looks at lots of different signals. We curate information from lots of different sources, and we measure sort of the average time of touching a record or a profile. And we like to try to approach the point at which if we did it any more frequently, we would just be wasting money. We would just be updating information with copies of itself. And if we did it any slower, we would miss important changes. And the trick is to find that balance where you're updating it frequently enough to capture all of the change or most of the change, and not so frequently that there's diminishing return. There's a lot of focus on that. There's a lot of technology measuring that effect and constantly responding to changes in the environment to get that balance just about right. So how do we identify companies that have been closed for business? This is a question that I think has been around probably since Dun & Bradstreet started doing business, and will be around long after all of us are gone, and I don't think there will ever be a crystal clear answer to that. It would be really nice if before any company that's in our database closes for business, they called us up and said, we're closing for business. Here's proof that we're closing for business. Here's people that will witness to the fact that we've closed. Here's a picture of us closing the door and locking it. But that doesn't happen. And most businesses don't go bankrupt or have any kind of major cataclysmic event that's observable to say they went out of business. So one of the things that we do is we see diminishing activity. We see less signals. We see less trade. We find that they're unreachable when we try to contact them. They become unconnected to the other sources of data that we have, and the data point essentially becomes isolated. And then we have algorithms and methods that we use to consistently ascribe the status of that business to the point where it's considered out of business. The trick here is to do this in a very consistent, empirical way, meaning that if we did it again, we would reach the same conclusion. But we also have to understand it's not a perfect process. Think about a small business owner that just decides to go on vacation and sail around the world for a year. All of those signals would drop to zero, right? It would seem like they were out of business. Then they come back, they dock the yacht, and they start doing business again, and all of a sudden they wake up. So there's these conditions that are very hard to see in the data, and they will always be there, and they will probably become more confounding as business behavior changes over time. The good news is that we have a lot of experts that are really good at thinking about things like that, and we do it in I think, a very consistent way, so that's good.